so we're right on top of the hour, but for all of you that have been so great to join us on time and early, we wanted to make sure that we're very respectful of your time and we get started as everybody trickles in. So we'll do some brief introductions and then jump into the content. First of all, thank you so much for coming. It means a lot to us. Anna and I have been focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion and a lot of things around it for a lot of our career. And it's something that we're both personally and professionally passionate about. And so we worked really hard to put a lot of practical content in here as far as a little bit of theoretical, because as you can tell, we're both PhDs, so we just couldn't help ourselves. But we promise like 96% is really practical information down to survey questions, recommendations, how to execute strategy, what to measure, etc. So thank you again so much for spending the next hour with us. I'll introduce myself briefly for those of you who don't know me. My name is Sonia Lucina. I'm the president of Question Pro Workforce. I have been with the company for a little bit over 2 years and got to know Question Pro as a loyal, one of the first customers in 2008. So now sit on the other side of the bench, but have just really enjoyed leading this business unit at Question Pro. And as a part of my role, really being able to do this kind of research to advance the market and help all the amazing and passionate individuals like yourselves that are looking to make a difference too, to share some data and hopefully give you more knowledge and even more energy to continue to do this really meaningful work. My PhD is in organizational psychology. I should mention that. And for fun, I actually sit in sunny Buenos Aires, Argentina right now. So in case you're wondering, all the white, and maybe if you see my short sleeve at some point, that will distill a little bit of the mystery. Anna, do you mind introducing yourself before we jump into all the content?
I don't mind. Hi, everyone. It is so nice to see so many familiar names and so many familiar faces on the, first of all, on the LinkedIn event, and then everywhere else that we've put a notice that we're going to be doing this. So my name is Ana Bedacarratz. I am also a psychologist. I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist. So I tend to be one of those folks that's more data focused, for better or for worse. And DEI is one of my passions. I've been involved in DEI work for a long time. A lot of times my involvement with it has been tangential and not something I did for work or got paid for. And now I can say that it is something that I do for work. So that's very exciting. And I look forward to talking to all of you about how to improve employee listening and how to really point it towards DEI. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. So before we jump into all the good stuff we prepared, we also quickly wanted to touch on who is Question Pro. And I realized that we've been presenting information for a really long time. And usually we get so excited to go into findings and talk about research that we sometimes don't even mention what company we work for. So real quick, Question Pro is an organization that's global. I mentioned I'm sitting in Argentina. Ana is actually sitting in Spain. Our colleague Guille, who is running the webinar behind the scenes, is in Mexico. We have a bunch of our team on from US, Germany, UK. So we're really all over the place, global organization, work from anywhere to our core. We're headquartered out of Austin, Texas, and we were founded actually in 2005. So I mentioned that back in the day, I was a client of Question Pros in 2008, and it wasn't even, the initiating year. So as a company, we've been around for quite a while. We have a little bit over 300 employees, again, all across the world. And our organization focuses really on 3 key areas. It's market research, customer experience, and employee experience. And both Anna and I are part of our employee experience or workforce team. But as you can imagine, we also do a lot of research overall, because that's where Our, big part of our heart is, and a lot of what actually informs a strategy when it comes to employee experience. It's about working with our customers directly and understanding their needs and what's going on inside their organization, but also taking a step back and looking at it as a market as a whole. Because what we like to do as much as possible, as quickly things are moving, is to be able to tell our customers, this is the patterns that we're seeing. Here's some important things we think are good for you to talk with your employees about, some data that would be good for you to collect internally. And a lot of the research that we do externally helps us inform that, to be able to be a really good partner to those organizations we care so much about. And we want to make sure that they have a good employee experience. And so, actually, a part of the reason for this webinar is that we just partnered recently with an organization called EQ Community that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is out of California, on a study called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is a Key Retention Strategy. And we teased some of our findings in our company event in Austin, Texas of October last year, when the data was hot off the presses. Anna and I were literally doing analysis as we were going to the conference. And we published the report in January, and it's been really well received. And we're so pleased to see how many individuals were finding value in data. It was helping them think about things differently. And again, we know that this space is so incredibly hard. And we haven't seen the strides that we want to as a community, as a society, because it's not something that changes overnight. But what really encourages us is to see how many more people are becoming a part of a conversation, how many more people are working in organizations formally. And Anna recently shared a report with me from LinkedIn that the diversity, equity, and inclusion roles were the second fastest growing. And wow, like that's just absolutely phenomenal during a time that it's a tough economy. A lot of organizations are going through change. It's really heartwarming to see that a lot of them are still able to keep an eye out on some of the fundamental things that are really important, both from a business sense, but also from a moral and ethical sense. And so here we didn't, the webinar was prompted by the study, but we're not going to be sharing exactly just the findings. We're sharing, again, more practical applications for your continuous listening strategy. But here were a couple of data points, I think, for you as you continue to make the case in your organization around why this is important. Probably ask for budget, as we all do usually, no matter what role we're in. Is one of the findings that was really the headline out of our research, is that 37% of workers overall said that they would switch companies to being part of a more diverse and inclusive culture. And oftentimes, like now, like it's so fun to be with all of you, but I would give anything to be able to see your faces and reactions. But I just see me and Anna, and that's okay. But in the event where we share this live, we shared the statistic that 37, so more than third of workers would leave a company to be a part of a more diverse and inclusive culture. And people's jaws dropped and their eyes opened wide. And we thought, okay, we're on to something here. A lot of times organizations don't ask that question necessarily, and definitely don't ask it as a part of an exit interview. We ask about pay and we ask about benefits and location and manager and etc. But there's this big driver why people are turning over that we're not necessarily accounting for. And I think it's really important. And then, of course, the number was even higher for Black or African American workers, and even higher for managers. And then the other stat that we just wanted to highlight, and there's a link to the study. We'll share it out if any of you don't have it, for you to read on your own time. But one of the things that also really jumped out at us is taking people's opinions into account when we're looking to make decisions. And so we asked people how many agree that when they speak up, their opinion is taken into account. And 72% of men compared to 61% of women said that they felt like they were seen and heard. And there was a big difference between managers and individual contributors. And so when we're thinking about creating more diverse workplaces, more inclusive workplaces, it is so incredibly important to not only give the voice to those individuals that we feel like we need to pay closer attention to around what kind of culture are we creating? How do they feel showing up to work every day? Not only giving them a voice and asking them about it, but then also looking at what do we do with that information and how do we report back on what we're doing. So we'll just leave you with these two sets of data points. Again, there's a lot more in the report, but we'll jump into all the practical things that I promised you we prepared for this webinar. Anna has particularly pulled in some really, really strong research. So I'll let her take this slide and talk through what she saw in some of her external research on the impact of diversity on team performance.
So I think many of you who are here are not a stranger to this notion that is depicted in this graph, and it's really it illustrates the promise that so many companies are investing in diversity and it's because diverse teams, if well managed, will be more productive than homogeneous teams. This is a graph from Korn Ferry based on several different pieces of research. But really what we're looking at is the promise of diversity here, but also slightly dangerous. There is a large opportunity for organizations to squander that if they don't manage diverse teams well. Right. So the risk is that if you don't have the proper systems in place, if people are not included, if they don't feel like they belong, if they don't have psychological safety and a series of these things that make diverse teams perform better, you will not even be at the same level as your typical homogeneous teams. You will be lower. These days, most large companies are not exactly homogeneous. Most large companies will be diverse even by accident. So this is why we think it's so important to pay attention to this and not have the attitude of, well, maybe we're not going to try to be diverse. You might end up diverse even without trying, and you're going to need to manage that. So without further ado, let's move over to today's agenda. So we're going to be talking today about how to influence diversity, equity, and inclusion in the most critical moments of the employee lifecycle. And we are fairly big proponents of looking at data throughout the employee lifecycle. That's the approach that we take in our product, and that's the approach that we take in our consulting projects, because it's a process. It's not static. It's a process with milestones. It's a process with checks for, are we going the right way? It's a process with checks for, is this backfiring? And all sorts of other things. We're going to be sharing a set of questions to assess the current state of DEI in your organization. Again, this is for inspiration. These are not the only questions that could be asked. We're going to talk around questions for a little bit longer. And we're also going to share some actions that you can take from DEI survey results.
Yeah. And as Anna mentioned, one of the things we worked hard to do is really sample the most important concepts, is because as all of you on this call know, diversity, equity, inclusion is not something that can be thoroughly discussed in 1 hour. There's so much to do, but these were some of our areas of expertise that we thought, in conversation with our colleagues, in conversation with thought leaders who are working on these subjects across the organizations, there were some things that were coming up again and again, some practices that organizations are experimenting with that are, looking like they're doing really well. And so a lot of that is really, for us to consider, for us to discuss, etc. So first, we wanted to take a look at really the employee life cycle, because as you can imagine, there are things that we can understand from day one until the last day. And all of them are extremely important. And how do we, with the best intention, with the greatest purpose, connect with our employees to ask them what's most important. Now, we've probably for quite a while heard about survey fatigue. And for a while, I've been saying it's not the fatigue around people actually answering questions. It's the fatigue around what do we do with that information. And so, one of the things that Anna and I also looked at as we prepared this information is maybe what are some of the questions that could be more easily actioned, more realistically actioned for a wider audience. We also looked into the participants for this webinar and all of those who have signed up. And you run quite a variety of size of organizations. And so there's probably people at different maturity levels, right? Or people at with different resources. Some of you might be a one person HR team that is taking on a lot more responsibility with this, but you feel so incredibly passionately about it that you want to make a difference. Or you might be sitting with a large global organization and you could have 10 people focusing on this, maybe more. And so also keep that in mind as we share some of these recommendations, that some of them might be general across the different organizations, or some of them might be more fitting for you today or in the future, depending on the kind of role that you're in. But the first touch point we wanted to mention obviously is onboarding. So chronologically, the first one, but also one that we've seen in research has a really lasting impression on employee productivity, on likelihood to stay, etc. So when you look at your onboarding, and we share a lot of this in the specific question and items that we're going to show you, but a lot of times in onboarding we see questions around, did you receive your equipment, did people show up on time? But a lot of it is really around relationships. A lot of it is around those first impressions. When I walk in on day one, whether physically or virtually, who am I meeting? What kind of relationship, what kind of conversations are we having? How are we spending time? Do these individuals look like me? Do they have my similar background? Have I met somebody in the first few days that I feel like, wow, I can really relate with that person's career progression, or I would love to be in their spot in 5 or 10 years. And I can imagine now that I see them and I see them in this role, I can imagine that kind of future for me in this organization. And so there's a lot of different touch points, and they say physically or virtually, because a lot of us are onboarding virtually. A lot of us might not walk into office and look around and see 100 people, but it's also about being very mindful. Who do you set these meetings with? Who does an individual have a conversation very much same as you would in person as you are virtually? And so when it comes to feedback during this time, of course, the person doesn't have a ton of experience with the organization yet, but a lot of times these first impressions are either you can win big or you've got to dig yourself out of a hole after it. And so that's why getting feedback on it. Hey, did you meet, different people? How is it going? And do you feel like you're being incorporated? Do you feel like you have what you need? How comfortable are you talking with your colleagues? All of those kinds of reaction measures are really important, week one, first month, a few months in, to see the step of every step of that journey, and to see, are there any patterns where maybe we have a really phenomenal first week because we put a lot of time and energy into it, but a month in, everyone goes back to their job and they're not really checking in on the new starters, and these individuals are maybe in remote roles, and so it's not as obvious that they feel a little bit isolated or not communicated with. So again, that first impression with the organization is so incredibly important. And then of course, looking into culture, um, as we've had conversations with different, again, organizations, different sizes, doing this kind of continuous listening, employee experience work, one thing that we've seen is that organizations are experimenting with different kinds of frequencies of surveys and different kinds of size of surveys. But today, just about everyone still has that annual, that big culture employee experience survey, where maybe it's no longer 30 minutes, maybe it's dropped down to 20 or 20, but it's this one where you're asking a lot of the information. It's going to give you guidance and direction on what's really important for us to look at next. And so, Anna, I'd love for you to share a little bit around what we talked around segmenting the data and what you can look in that data to, especially when it comes to DEI, to help set that direction.
Well, we speak to a lot of clients who are thinking about DEI for the first time, or thinking about putting a lot more care and resources into DEI in their organization, as we've seen. And sometimes there is this idea that I need a DEI survey, or where do I start? And as Sonia said, most organizations already have a survey that can be segmented. So yes, it is important to ask DEI specific questions. You're probably already asking some of these questions in this big cultural or employee experience survey that you've been running for years. And so step one is probably to look at all the data that you have and start segmenting it. Most of the time when we talk about DEI work, we talk about demographics, and we talk about intersectionality. We also talk about aspects of diversity that may not be about demographics. And that's also a matter of maturity, right? Companies will start with the demographics, and they will easily have this data about their employees somewhere in their HR system, and available to segment with. So that's step one, right? Step two, we advise a lot of people to consider, if they're not already including some of these questions that speak to people's experience, whether they're being included, whether they have psychological safety, and all of these things that we tend to think about with DEI. Think about including them. Think about including at least some of them in this grand survey, and not just having a separate survey, because they are valuable things, and you do want DEI integrated in all the work that you do, and not just be a separate piece that you look at sometimes once a year, once every couple of years when things are really bad. So yeah, big opportunity with this culture survey. And then also we want to make sure that our questions are really actionable. So one of the things that you can think about fixing as you go through this culture survey and any other is, what action am I going to take if the data turn out this way or that way? Could I ask this question in a different way now after looking at these results that I got last year, so that next year I take better action, or I target my action better towards specific groups that I've identified?
Yeah, and I definitely want to iterate, like, or reiterate that, because that's an exercise that we even just did internally. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time, and we're about to actually launch our internal question pro, our big annual survey. And we did quite a review of our DEI items, because one of the things that we realized is, as we've been looking at this and looking at the data, that there's certain lingo that might not be commonplace for everyone. Or if you work in an organization where you're maybe translating your survey to different languages, but still sending it to in English to some of your population where maybe English is not their first language, or for whatever reason, it's just not as easily understood. Making sure that those items are clear is so important, because sometimes when we're in this work, some terminology just becomes very second nature to us. But when you share that with somebody that doesn't think about it every day, like, but I actually don't know what you mean. And people might not always say that in a survey. So to, as much as possible, make things colloquial, I think is incredibly important. And then going into, oh, sorry, I'm going way ahead, going back to Pulse. Going back to what Anna was mentioning about actionable data from questions, and really asking questions that you can follow up on, that is probably one of the most critical exercises that you can do before sending a survey, because there are sometimes things we're just curious about, and they are important to know. Now you need to make a decision that if you find out that something is a pain point in your organization, Will you have the time and resources? Do you think that data is going to give you the time and resources to take action on it? If you feel like the more than likely it won't, it's important to consider asking those questions, because that's where a lot of frustration comes in with people, where you ask something really sensitive. And that's actually slightly related, maybe not exactly DEI, but a conversation I was having with some of my fellow organizational psychologists around pay and benefits. Nobody's happy about it usually, nobody. And so a few of my friends had said, they've gotten quite creative in how they ask those questions, because if people say they're not really satisfied, generally an action item is not like, oh, we found out people are not satisfied, so 10%, 20% raise for everyone. Most organizations can't do that. And so it's something similar with the DEI journey, is to say, what are the kinds of things that we can ask about? And what are some things that if we feel like, oh, we didn't do well on this, we know we can take action on? Because those are the most important things to ask about and most important things to follow over time. Something else that I'm hoping is gaining in popularity is manager specific kind of needs. So maybe kind of we only tied to organizational initiatives, but managers are going to have to be very closely involved. So, what do they need as far as support? That's an example of a pulse survey that you can do. That if you find that there are specific needs when it comes to DEI, that if you find that, people are saying maybe my manager is not being very inclusive, or I don't have constructive conversations, you could have training and development. And I think that's a good idea. There could be some other things and some other challenges with managers that maybe that won't solve for. Do they feel overwhelmed? Do they feel like it's something they want to do, but they have too many other competing objectives that they have to report on? Um, I've also heard sometimes people say, listen, it was never part of my job description. It's not one of my objectives. Like, okay, let's fix that. But having that conversation with managers specifically, because they can drive so much change, is really important. And then also another one is checking in with a key group of employees. So if you find out in your data that there is a particular challenge in a department, or there's a particular challenge with a demographic group, digging further into that as a pulse, as a conversation, as a focus group is really critical. It doesn't require your entire workforce to take another survey. It does not require you to take another year to figure that out, but it's really thinking about those ongoing conversations and making them very pointed. And then again, in our conversations, we've heard companies do pulse surveys weekly. We've heard them do it monthly, quarterly. There's no recipe yet. But the one thing that has been a common thread is what we're trying to get out of those surveys, and how much can we really bring back an action and report back to our employees. That is really what guides both the frequency and what guides what the survey is about. And then the final one is on the way out. Anna, do you want to touch on some of the things we were mentioning with exits?
Well, sure. Exit is a big one, because I think organizations might think it's a little late to include some questions in an exit survey, right? What are we going to learn? These people are already leaving. And so many times they try to include the more typical exit reasons that are on their agenda or could be on their agenda to do something about in the future, such as I'm leaving because I have a bad relationship with my boss, or I'm leaving because I'm not getting paid well, or these large overarching reasons that people exit organizations. And there's really an opportunity for DEI professionals to include more inclusion-oriented questions, more diversity-oriented questions in exit surveys, because it will help them make a business case for doing this in the future. And what we're seeing in the market right now is that, and this has been pointed out by a lot of different organizations, we are seeing shifts, big shifts in terms of women leaving organizations. And we've seen this since the beginning of the pandemic, but right now what we're seeing is women managers leaving organizations in order to take jobs at more inclusive places, right? So we're seeing these employees making a statement and, talking the talk and walking the walk around diversity and inclusion, and demanding that this is something organizations pay more attention to. And to their credit, organizations are paying more attention to it. As Sonia mentioned, we've seen that some of the fastest growing roles in the US are now around diversity and inclusion management, HR analytics, and all of these things. So even as the economy is where it is, organizations are paying attention to their credit.
Absolutely. So now to the super, super practical part of our webinar. Anna and I spend quite a bit of time going through and coming up with what we thought could be some key survey questions that you can use. So again, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There are a lot more questions that, could be relevant to your organization. Some of these could be more, some of them could be less. But our goal here was, in some ways, you can literally copy and paste some of these and run a survey tomorrow if you want. This is just one of the slides. There's 3 more full of questions, and that it gives you some of an idea around some of the ways that we've thought through how do we maybe ask things in a more practical way, in a more actionable way. There's also research that Anna and I were discussing where there's, questions that you can ask inside your organization that tell you what's going on inside your organization, and other questions that might get at why. So if you're maybe, there's frustration with career progress, there's, the what is the frustration, but the why could maybe be, my manager and I don't talk about my goals. Maybe I don't feel evaluated fairly. Maybe I don't feel like I get constructive feedback from our manager. So these are, again, some of the different items. And I believe they were diversity, equity, and inclusion, the 3 different buckets. Again, and in the study, again, you will see, and I know there was a question earlier around where the data for this study was collected. This particular one was US workers only. It was a sample of 1,000 people across different industries, but focused on knowledge workers, because there is some differences in the questions that we asked, that we wanted to make sure we're not, just we're a little more focused on particular types of work. And so you'll be able to see in some of the data that we represent there, maybe a loose benchmark or something that you could see, wow, these are some of the things that are going on. Here are the questions that they asked in their study. I wonder how I compare inside my organization. And so even questions like, I have the opportunity to work alongside individuals with a variety of backgrounds. We kept backgrounds broad for purpose. If there are any, you could tease that out, and you could ask about ages, you could ask about races, you could ask about genders. A lot of times what's interesting with diversity is it's an area that's maybe a little more easily quantifiable, because if you collect that information as a part of your hiring process, you can see, well, we have this many women, or maybe it's in your HIRS, but it doesn't always guarantee how many individuals of different backgrounds somebody is interacting with. So they might exist in the organization, and maybe somebody is a part of a homogeneous team. Maybe somebody is in a role of more of an individual contributor, and they don't really feel like they interact with others. So there are different kinds, even when it comes to diversity. There are definitely different questions around perceptions and people's experiences that are really important to take into account. Anna, I don't know if you want to touch on equity and inclusion before I clear the whole slide myself.
Of course. I will say that equity is sometimes it can be hard for organizations to include in surveys. It's the one that is most scary, right? And also it's an area where organizations many times already have data that speaks to, for example, pay equity, whether you're paying people equally for equal work. For legal reasons, many organizations in many corners of the world now have to conduct pay audits, for example. And this opportunity is about including questions around equity and perceived equity in surveys, right? Because equity is not equality. This is the first thing that we need to remember as DEI professionals. Equity is not equality. Equity is about giving people what they need and elevating historically disadvantaged and underrepresented groups so that they can contribute to their full potential, right? So it's really not about equality. It's about feeling that people have the resources to succeed, that they don't have to put in twice the work to get the same amount of appreciation, or to get a promotion, or to have impact, have success in an organization, right? And it's about being evaluated fairly. It's about having access to power in a myriad of different ways, from your manager talking to you about your goals before they're set, to having your opinions and ideas valued and considered in decision making more broadly. And so we advocate hard for including these questions in surveys, as scary as they can be. As far as inclusion, it can be sometimes hard, sometimes difficult to distinguish, okay, where does diversity end and where does equity begin, and what are we talking about now? Are we talking about inclusion? Are we talking about diversity? And the best answer I have to this is that these boundaries are conceptual, right? They're useful insofar as they help you as a professional understand, with a useful framework, what are the problems that you're trying to address, or what are the gaps that you're trying to close. But we don't have to get super picky about them when we do the actual research and when we put them in surveys, right? That being said, a lot of people I have heard be very particular about inclusion, and specifically very particular around, when I ask about inclusion, I prefer to ask about behaviors, because they're the most actionable things that I can ask about, right? Rather than ask whether someone's feeling included, where you can imagine the person reading the questions. What does that mean? I don't know, I guess. You can ask whether, your manager makes sure that your voice is heard in meetings. That's more concrete. That's a behavior. That's something you can wrap your head around much more easily. And you can still ask I questions, right? And so not just ask about how you're treated, but also how things make you feel, but try to make them about behaviors, so that when you do look at those data and you segment based on your women managers versus your Black individual contributors, you're going to be able to tell that, there is a pattern in how managers are behaving that we could try to address, or there is a pattern in how people are being treated by teammates that we could try to address. So a lot of these questions in the back, we think of driver questions and outcome questions. So having a blend in surveys of, what are you really including that you're thinking of measuring as an outcome and measuring progress on in the future. And that's typically done in pulse surveys. And what are you really including that you're including in order to dig into the why, to look at the factors of, okay, this affects that. I think I've exhausted what I wanted to say here, so
I
we
love
can
it.
move on.
And I love like what Anna was saying too, some of the practice that we've been evolving in the way we ask questions is the perception of what's going on in the organization overall versus my personal experience. So we've gone through like, oh, people in our organizations are, rewarded fairly or get, well, I don't know. Like I know about my assignments, but I'm not sure about every, 300 people in our organization or 1,000 people or, but then there's different ways that if you ask the general perceptions and combine it with your own personal experience, and it gives you these really different and interesting views of the data. So that's something that we've been evolving a lot in our questions to say not only what's the general perception of the organization, but what can I speak most accurately to? And usually it's how I'm experiencing things and what my personal experience has been. And do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? Versus like only asking about, I think my, colleagues in general do. So, moving on to the pulse surveys, again, these are just sample questions. And as we were mentioning, a lot of what you will pulse will be driven by what you found earlier in your research generally. Pulse surveys are rarely used to uncover some big new patterns sometimes, because maybe you did your annual survey in January and the world changed quickly in a quarter, which now it always does. And so you want to ask about some new concepts, but a lot of it would be a follow up. Now, some of the different questions that we mentioned here is around, for example, the growth, the development, and the relationships. So much for any of you that have studied, and I've done this together in our past lives, organizational network analysis and relationships and the strengths with those. We know how much of an impact our team, our direct manager has on our sense of belonging, on how included we feel. Um, so that's to pause that and feel like how are people generally feeling, especially if you're going through any work arrangement transitions. That's a really big one, and a lot of organizations still are. So when you move somebody from maybe being in an office to giving more flexibility to be at home, or you're doing hybrid, understanding that sense of inclusivity is really important, because oftentimes that visibility again is not as easy, but it comes even more important to know how is that person feeling in general in their interactions in their organization. And so for these, I'll go through a couple of them a little more quickly, just being conscious of time. But we did want to also give some examples of onboarding, because like we mentioned, a lot of what we've seen traditionally measured in onboarding is, did I have, if I work in an office job, do I have my computer? Did I get my email? Can I sign into things? Do I know, have I met my manager? That gets more into relationships. Now, thinking about that inclusivity again, for those of you who might have joined us later, just to reiterate, because I know sometimes it's good to say things a few times before they really sink in, but those first few days are so incredibly important. And actually, recently I had a conversation with someone and we were talking about onboarding, and we were talking about the role of chief diversity officer specifically. And what came up in the conversation is that person said, but onboarding is usually not a part of the chief diversity officer's role. And I thought, but you know what? I think it could really be important for it to be, because that's one area that if this individual who's very well versed in the matter is saying that's not an area where a chief diversity officer is usually included, but we have these huge opportunities to improve. Well, that's an interesting spot to look at differently, because maybe that's an area that hasn't been touched as much, that can have this like first new and lasting impression. And Anna and I actually are now following up. Stay tuned. The next month or so, we're releasing a global benchmarking study that includes candidate experience, onboarding, the employee life cycle. And we're digging into onboarding a little more. And one of the things that we're realizing is some of the area of opportunity there is a lot of times you have a talent acquisition team and they're focused on recruitment and they have their specific KPIs. And then you have a team focused on culture, a team focused on diversity. But onboarding is not like, you don't have like a chief onboarding officer or head of onboarding
His
usually.
job.
Yeah, but it's so critical. And then you're like, oh no, but the manager will handle it, HR team will handle that. But it's this incredible opportunity to establish that relationship and have that dialogue. So what Anna and I are brainstorming, and again, that will be in the next report, but are there maybe some greater opportunities where we're seeing like, goodness, between all of us, we're doing so much to move the needle and it's going a lot slower than a lot of us would have hoped. Could this be an area that we can spend more time on, that we could actually see a greater ROI? Because a lot of us haven't really invested as much time. And so that's where we get to some of these questions like, I met my team members, I met the key people I was going to work with, I'm satisfied with the connections, because all of a sudden it's that more humanity. It's not just that, maybe my laptop didn't make it on day one and it really was crappy that I couldn't log into my email. But I had a really great conversation with one of my colleagues. And maybe if I'm there in person, we went out to lunch and I felt like I learned so much about the organization and it was so humanized. And also, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it's around individuals again that you meet during that onboarding process. So I'm a mom. I have a young kid. How do moms do in this organization? Like, we read a lot, and Anna was mentioning about the disproportionate impact on women. And any of you moms or dads that have had little kids or been around little kids, it's a handful. And for me, I can very candidly say that before I had a kid, I was like, I can stay at office until 7 o'clock, no problem. Now it's like 6 o'clock and whoosh, I'm out of here because my kid is waiting for me downstairs. The nanny's going. It's a little bit of a different shift in dynamic. And a lot of times, whatever our unique situation is, we're looking to see, are there people around who are going through something similar? Are they thriving in this organization? Are they loving being a part of it? Because that's going to give me even more hope. That's going to give me even more determination and more energy from day one, that this is the place where I truly belong. So again, that exposure and then measuring, how are we doing? Because it's also great to have these really good intentions. It's great to come up with a plan. Again, if there's a little bit, to use a psychological term, diffusion of responsibility, and maybe nobody 100% owns onboarding, but everybody owns onboarding. And so Anna's my manager, and she didn't show up on day one because she thought my HRBP is going to show up, and my HRDPP didn't show up because she thought my manager was going to show up, and it creates a mess. In the end, we want to just have those checks and balances around, how is everything going? How is everything going on week one? How is everything going after 30 days? Is everybody across the organization performing in a similar way? Because that's another thing we saw, that it's very different, especially for larger organizations, how onboarding is done. So huge opportunities in those areas. And then Anna, I'll let you touch on exit before we go into some of our other action steps for what could be
My
done next.
favorite topic. Well, as we were saying, exit and onboarding might be overlooked, right? But it's also important to sometimes with these questions, with the way we get in touch with employees, what is the message that you're sending by simply asking the questions that you're asking? And we have a lot of examples of this from our daily lives, right? Most of us are parents. It's a little bit like teaching your kids, right? You're teaching them even when you're not, right? Or more specifically, they're learning things even when you're not trying to teach them specifically. And so it's kind of the same with surveys in organizations and with continuous listening. Sometimes you want to ask a question because you think the answer will be useful. Sometimes you want to ask a question because you want to highlight that that's something that's really important to you as an organization. So regardless of the answer that people will give, and this is oftentimes something that happens with open-ended questions, right? We know that most people are not going to touch those on a survey, but they're really important to include because some might, and because it sends a powerful message and gets people thinking. And that's also something that we try to achieve with surveys.
Yeah. I was going to add, if any of you are interested, Anna actually recently authored a paper about behavioral changes that surveys themselves can do. So that's something that we don't always or often talk about. but surveys give us data on obviously what's going on inside the organization, how our employees are thinking and feeling, but there are also ways that you can write survey questions that actually prompts behavioral changes. And so we have a whole other paper around that. If you're interested, just send us a note and we'd be happy to share it with you, because that's something else that you can start to think about incorporating in your surveys. Now, of course, I'm not silly to say, oh, you put in a few items and you like all of your problems will be solved. Of course not. But it's just another way that we haven't, I think, leveraged as much as practitioners. And it is an area of opportunity for us to continue to see and to make change. So what are some ideas for actions that you can take, being conscious that we have 11 minutes left? We could probably spend hours more with you, but we want to touch on these really quickly too. And these are some of the findings that we found from our market research survey. And again, something that we think would be good for you to ask personally inside your organization to see if it's true for you as well. But one of the things that we found, again, survey was 1,000 workers across the US, and we found that 43% were not satisfied with how much action is being taken to foster an inclusive culture. And then, of course, if you look at the chart on the left, it's probably not surprising that it's higher for women and higher for Black or African American workers, right? So they're looking for more action. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, yeah, I would love to have, more resources. I would love to have more time. I would love to have a bigger budget. What could you do with what you have today? One is to reflect on what is it that you're focusing on? What is it that you're prioritizing? And oftentimes we're really big fans of doing fewer things, but really moving the needle, and then trying to take on too many things at once, because it is challenging and there are going to be competing priorities, and without fail something's always going to happen that we don't expect. And so if we say this is our real north, this is the difference that we want to make and go towards that, it's easier to stay focused on it. It can also still be at times challenging, but it's easier to have that north and make progress towards it. um what are some of the things that you can take on? But one of the things to remember, and we'll share a stat after, is you don't need to do this alone. So what does that mean? You might have a really small team. You could be a one-person team. You have a bunch of different priorities, but people in your organization want to help. If you involve them in something that they're passionate about, all of a sudden your team in making this strategic change really grows. Now, how you communicate that, how you select them is important. But what we're seeing with organizations that are having more success and progress is that it's never just up to the diversity team. It's never just up to the HR team. It is this bigger group of people that are passionate about making a change, passionate about the organization, that are making that difference. And I put in this cartoon, it was actually posted on social media by Adam Grant. And I love it because how often, I mean, just look at this. How often do you feel like that? Where you're like, oh my God, I'm doing so much. Like I just had a conversation with one of my colleagues like an hour ago where we were saying now, like, we're doing so much and we feel like there's still so much more to do. And are we moving the needle? And please take the time to reflect, because you certainly are. And this is a big battle and it's a long battle and there's so much to do. But any one of you that are taking the time to be with us, to listen to this, whether it's live, whether it's in a recording, you've probably already climbed so much of a mountain. Take time to celebrate that and take time to realize what those steps are, because that comes to our next action item, which is around communication. So if you think about what you're accomplishing as this big north, at this huge mountain that you want to climb, you have to know what the steps are and you have to celebrate those steps and celebrate them with your organization, communicate them to your organization. The reason why we say that, and again, you might have this as a part of your employee surveys already, communication is usually an area of challenge for most companies. Most employees want to know more, want to know things differently. In our study, we found that 52% of workers were not really satisfied with how frequently the company discussed the importance of diversity. So probably what's likely happening with a lot of organizations is there's work being done behind the scenes, but you feel like you gave yourself this goal, and I have no idea if you can see me in the screen, but a high goal, and you're going towards it, but you wish you were farther along. Make sure you take the time to look back and say, wow, that was a big jump that we made. That was a leap. We made some big changes. we want to tell everybody about it. Make sure that you're communicating what you're doing, communicating what you're trying, communicating what you're experimenting with your teams, with your employees, because they will celebrate that. Because what happens is that when people don't hear anything, they assume nothing's happening. Because of course, if something was happening, like why wouldn't somebody tell me? And so here we joked. We actually recently did a podcast with one of our partners, colleagues, friends that works for a communication company. And I had a bullet that says you can't over communicate. And then I remember, wait, no, you can. But it's important to ask your employees for their preferred way of receiving communication. The reason I say that is because Anna and I wrote this list in like 2 seconds. We're like, what are all the different ways that information can go? And that's why we put there, and we're sure that there are many more today. There's no lack of trying to get information to somebody, right? We have more channels than we ever have in our lives. Making sure that we're getting information to the people in a way that they want to receive it and where they're actually going to look is really important. So that's another good thing to ask, to know, again, as you're communicating all of these big things, where are the most critical ways or places for you to put it? And then also who's delivering that message. So remember, we were mentioning a few times before is that we mentioned it in sense of onboarding, but it's true the entire employee life cycle, is that it's not only about your diversity initiatives, it's not only about the inclusion, the equity, but also be mindful about who's delivering that message. That it doesn't always have to be your chief diversity officer, VP, or somebody specifically in HR. If you have especially people from across the organization who are involved, give them, one of them, a voice, give them the platform to share this, because that is going to give your employees another point of excitement, another area where they're going to say, wow, not only is the organization caring about this, investing in this, but I'm seeing somebody like me that's involved in it, that's really successful, that's getting visibility in this organization. What a great place to be. I can also see myself in there. And so then finally, one that we mentioned before too is about empowering managers and giving them accountability to make that bigger difference. But a big part in that is, again, having the conversation with them around what they need, not just throwing them maybe in a generic training, assuming everybody's at the same level. They could be very different ones. Their needs could be different. Their challenges and why they're spending time or not being effective could be very different. And so to give that survey, to have that focus group, to have that conversation is really critical in order to help them be even more successful in those kinds of roles. Anna, would you add anything before we start wrapping
I
up with our
would.
last
I think a big one
year?
here, because you could tell I was thinking,
Yeah.
a big one here is involving managers throughout the research process, for lack of a better word. And a lot of times when looking at survey questions that are about them, my manager XYZ, it will be very useful to do that, because your managers will tell you this is not specific enough. This is a question where I'm being evaluated. It's interesting, right? There is this data that will come out. It's sort of there is an inspiration to it, but it's really hard for me to tell, and probably for anyone, what should I be doing differently? What should I be doing more of? What should I be doing less of? Where should I pay more attention, less attention, and all of that? So do involve your managers if you can, throughout the process, and not just tell them what to do at the end, right?
Absolutely. So with that, just wrapping up, what now? Where do we go from here? So we tease this information a little bit, but bear with us with a really long pointed question that we did in one of our separate surveys. Is we asked workers, again, across the US, if your employer asked you to help with an initiative that would help improve how much you enjoy working there and how fulfilled you feel, how likely would you want to participate in helping? And 66% of people said absolutely. So that's 2/3 of the general workforce. Yours could be higher, maybe a little lower, but that's still a lot of people that are saying, if I feel like an initiative is going to impact me, I'm willing to be a part of it. I want to help. And we wanted to share this data to give you encouragement again, that if you're feeling frustrated because you have a lot of ideas and you want to do more and you only feel like you have so much time and so many resources, do look inside your organization, because this data to us is very encouraging that each one of you, even if it's not 66% of your workforce, maybe, that there is going to be a significant number of people who you can recruit to help you move these initiatives forward. So please make sure to look at them. And then the
And to
last
add,
final, yeah.
the social psychologist initiatives will work better if you involve
Yes.
people from the grassroots. So it's not just getting things off your plate. They will work better.
Absolutely. So with the last hot minute, and we'll get all the questions because we won't get to the Q&A, but we'll anything you have, we'll share our contact information. We'll look in the chat. So just to recap, choose your areas of focus and initiatives. We said for the first half of the year, we're in February. There's still some months to go, but give yourself a time limit, give yourself a focus. Can experiment with things. One of the things that's really important is that not every initiative will work, and that's okay. We try to refrain from using the word failure because it can have a negative connotation, but an experiment, a lot of times better received. Again, involve a wider group of employees, like Anna was saying, it'll work better. You'll have a bigger team. Um, Test, measure, adjust. All of this is an iterative process. You don't have to get it right from the start, but if you don't try, you will not move the needle. And then finally, we'll share our contact information right now, our LinkedIn's, our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're always doing research around this. We're always working with companies to help. So if what we shared today with you resonated, if you'd like to have a conversation with us around, where do I go from here? Or if you want to share, if something maybe didn't resonate with you, or if you think about something differently, or if you build off of it, we'd love to know that too, because the more we learn, the more we can iterate and improve on what we do, and give that information back, in these kinds of ways to the wider society, because we are really big believers that only together are we going to be able to make this big impact. So the more we learn, the more we try to move things ahead as a community, the more successful we'll be. So with that, I think we're just 1 minute over. Thank you so very much for your time. Anna, thank you always for your amazing work and for your
Thank you so
passion and
much.
dedication around this. Thank you everybody for coming. It really makes our hearts warm to see how many of you care about these initiatives, making these changes. So if there's any way that we can help you moving ahead, please don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you so much again for your time today.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.